So this week, Kingdom Come Deliverance comes out for the PS4, the Xbox, and PC. And it's a game that's being heralded already as being the next big thing in sandbox gaming and a potential Skyrim killer. And yet, for some reason, it's completely under the mainstream radar. So what we thought we would do is, in celebration of this game being released, we would talk about some other, significant games in our developmental years from being gamers that, for all accounts, should have been mainstream successes, but for whatever reason just didn't really catch on, but are still legendary, not only to us, but I'm sure for millions of gamers around the world. Welcome back to the second draft.
Welcome back. So the first one that I have, and I don't know if this is necessarily a flew under the radar because it came much later than its intended games. But the one that stuck out to me and as a kind of a formative game and one that not a lot of people know of when I refer to it is Namco Museum. I played it on PlayStation, the PS1 when it came out, and essentially what it was a collection of cabinet games from the 80s that were just super popular. So it had all the classics like Miss Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Galaga, and what I mostly played it for was Galaga because that was the game that my dad played and he was really interested in. Of course, like if I'm looking at these 8-bit games, like what am I? And I think it might have graduated at that point to 16-bit, but they're fairly simplistic games. I'm most interested in the ones that my dad was really hyped up about. He played Galaga in the arcade and you paid $16 to beat the game the first time he ever did it, and he beat it, and it was like, okay, I did it, there it is. And he said that was a typical thing for kids to do back in the day. It was just spend hours and hours and days at the arcade to try to beat the one game they needed to. So I felt like I gotta kind of not necessarily live vicariously through that, but at the same time get that arcade experience through Namco Museum, and it was pretty great. And at the same time to be able to experience all the classics on a platform that I was familiar with was pretty great because I knew the controls for the PlayStation better than, I mean, it's pretty simple to go left, right, and click the button, but
Right.
I now enjoy playing the cabinet games when I go to, a traditional arcade or like a Dave and Buster's or something like that. But it's because I had that time with Namco Museum before where I was like, I have to get that double ship in Galaga or get to the next level in Miss Pac-Man and figure out the pattern, right? Yeah, it's pretty great.
Yeah, that's cool. The first game on my list isn't nearly as influential in my life, but it's just a game that I really, really enjoyed back in my teenage years, and a game that just for whatever reason didn't really catch on, and that's Severance: Blade of Darkness. And it came out in 2001. I think it was like February of 2001. And what it was a third-person perspective, combat-based RPG. And what was cool about it was the fact that it was brutally effing hard, but the combat system was very intuitive and very precise for the time. And what was cool about it was also super violent, and it was scary as hell because you can literally be killed in one hit, or you can kill an enemy in one hit. So it was published by Codemasters. It was kind of like a cult classic, I guess, if you will. And for me personally, I love playing it because I love those super hard RPGs, and I got my friends into it, so we'd play at LAN parties and whatnot. But you never heard about anybody talking about it on the internet. You never, saw forums for it, people trading tips and whatnot, because just for whatever reason, nobody played the game. But the combat, for as clunky as it was for being a 2001 PC game, was like way beyond its time. It was very influential in terms of what came after it, and it was also kind of a taste of things to come. It was really cool, a lot of fun. Again, super violent, but it was just one of those games where you'd be walking along through like a broken down old castle or something, and you would turn a corner and you'd see like a dimly lit hallway with like an ogre standing at the end of it. And in this game, you just knew that, oh my god, I better save because chances are I'm going to die like 50 times trying to kill this thing because it was just brutally hard. But once you learn all the ins and outs of the combat and you learn the mechanics of the game itself, combat became sort of a dance, which is how it should be. And it's one of the things that people talk most about Kingdom Come Deliverance is the fact that the combat is very hard and very realistic. So that's what made me think of Blade of Darkness, because it's very much like a prototypical game of what came after it, but it's sadly just utterly overlooked in the gaming community. It's so weird.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like Doom or something like that, where you just don't know what's going to happen, and you kind of have to figure it out, and you learn by failing almost.
Exactly. Yeah.
Dark Souls. People talk about Dark Souls that way.
See, this is like the original Dark Souls, but nobody ever played it. Like, people absolutely love Dark Souls for being as difficult and as punishing as it is, and Blade of Darkness was wholly rewarding as an experience, but just so brutally difficult, and you play the same 15 minutes over and over again trying to beat that one enemy and trying to find that better sword. Was also cool, so you can kill an enemy, pick up their weapons and their armor and their shields and move along with them, which was cool. But yeah, I mean, I'm surprised nobody's ever tried to like remake it or try to like, because retro gaming is so big right now, nobody's ever tried to like revive that game and make it popular again, because it pretty much is like the prototypical Dark Souls in a way. So
yeah, and I'm gonna get a little bit off topic here, but people have been, that was one of the critiques that people had for Destiny 2, was that they were expecting some transition of the looter shooter into a more typical loot situation, where you would go to a specific place, beat the boss, and you would know where you were and when it was that you got that specific loot, as opposed to getting an engram and then going back, cashing in, and being like, oh yeah, I have the legendary, or I have the exotic that I've been waiting for. You knew because you got it from that specific enemy, right? And then you moved on with it. And that was the kind of like influential moment, and you can remember that. And they were talking about how they had that kind of in Destiny 1, and people were saying that, you know, what they really need is bring back the traditional loot sense, that you would go defeat an enemy, get the loot from that specific thing, and then you'd have that. And the game, my next game is similar to that. It had a loot system that was kind of like that, or you kind of more Dungeons and Dragons based, more
Diablo type of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You beat a boss over and over again, hoping to get a specific weapon, and once you picked up that weapon or piece of armor you wanted, you knew you got it because you beat Diablo himself or something, as opposed to you played a raid and you got an engram, and then you had to just kind of play like a roulette or like a slot machine and hope you got what you were looking for. Yeah. I love Destiny 2, but yeah, I mean, the loot system in like Diablo 2 and 3 is way more rewarding, because it's more instant gratification and less of like, there's still the RNG element, but when you see that boss drop that item and you pick up that item, there's a sense of accomplishment, as opposed to picking up like an abstract basically, and then trading in that abstract and hoping you get it. Like, there's a needless extra set of steps to get to that point. It's kind of, it's again, I love Destiny 2, but it is a convoluted loot system. They could just streamline it. I don't know why they don't. But.
Yeah. And I think, and the game that I want to talk about is probably the most formative game that I've played, other than maybe the Halo 2 multiplayer, not necessarily the game, but the multiplayer itself, which we could talk about that for an entire other video about how that it kind of like changed the spectrum. But the game that I'm talking about is Legend of Dragoon, which was just an incredible game made back in the 90s. It was it was a project that started in like 96, and I barely knew what video games were at that point. And Sony Computer Entertainment put it together with a really small team, and the idea was that it was going to be a competitor for Final Fantasy. And a lot of people, when they critique the game, they say it's just a rip-off of Final Fantasy, because that's the game that kind of took off and people know and they're familiar with it now, and it's got a long string of 15 some odd games. But Legend of Dragoon had a lot of heart and soul to it that a lot of people say Final Fantasy was lacking. And that's because, you know, there was attention to the story and the fighting mechanics. It took a lot of things that you see now, like a lot of mechanics that you see in turn-based RPG games now came from these kind of games. So it was made for the PlayStation 1 back in, I think it was released in 2000. And essentially what it was is turn-based attack systems where you had additions. So essentially, if you're going to attack something, it was a little square, and as you got closer, there was another square that came together, and when the two squares met, you were supposed to hit the X button, and that would make your character hit. And if you hit properly, you would hit again, and you get another square, or until you finish the move set. And so if you missed, then you just did the one attack, so you missed out on the combination possibility. And so they made turn-based RPGs a little bit more interesting and like active, So it was still story based, and you're still interacting with the world around you and involved in the story, but you still had to be cognizant of what was happening during the battle sequences. More than like, I need to give this person a potion, and I need to give this person needs to attack, and this person needs to retreat or whatever.
Right.
That being said, like, it was the longest game I'd ever played up until that point, and still is one of the longest games I've ever played. The longevity was, I think the first time I ever played it, something like 60 hours I put into it, because it's 4 discs of content. And you don't see that very often anymore. Like, these just games that are solely focused on the storyline, they have something to tell. It got made into a manga, however you want to say it, book. Only released in Japanese, never into English, but because the story was so great. And I remember that was one of the few things that sticks out to me, is that I remember names of the characters that I played like almost a decade later, even though I hadn't picked up the game. It's just an incredible turn-based game that was like fully character focused and had a lot of mechanics that like took you in out of like your headspace and put you into this world, which was just one of the first times I kind of had that video game experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There's been a bunch of games like that for me as well. So my next game is not one of those games. It was just a really fun game. It was a really fun game that I enjoyed, and it's actually, oddly enough, a Final Fantasy game, but it's not one of the mainstream Final Fantasy games. It's Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, which was a Nintendo GameCube exclusive. And it wasn't the deepest or most interesting game, but it was one of those weird like Nintendo innovations that just, as we've seen time and time again, for whatever reason, just didn't pan out. So it was your typical isometric RPG type thing, where you level up your characters, you collected new items, and so forth and so on. Single player was fun enough for what it was. But the interesting aspect of it, what made it so unique, and I think what ultimately doomed it, but simultaneously made me love it, was that in order to play multiplayer, all the players involved, typically 4 players, had to have a Game Boy Advance. And you had to have a connecting cable that would plug through an adapter into the GameCube. So what you would do is you'd have 4 people set up with handheld GBAs plugged into the GameCube, and your GBA acts as a second screen. So you're able to all sit around the TV and play this game and use your GBA to manage your inventory or look at a map or find out your objectives and whatnot. It was innovative as hell. What we've seen now is, with the Wii and the Wii U and now the Switch, that whole handheld aspect coming back in a big way, and they're kind of doing it right this time around. But Crystal Chronicles, with the GBAs plugged in, if you knew 4 people that had GBAs, I was lucky enough to have a group of friends. You actually know them, Jensen and a few others. They all had GBAs. I had one as well. We'd get together and we'd play this. And it wasn't just the fact that it was a multiplayer game where we all had GBAs and it was a weird, quirky setup. It was also the fact that it was very much squad-based for an RPG. It was all about coordination and teamwork. So the basic story of the game was the world is covered in like a miasma, like a deadly fog. And the only thing protecting various villages is, the quintessential important Final Fantasy crystals. So every village has a crystal, and it needs to be recharged with spirit or juice or something from trees scattered around the world. So you basically had to travel out and collect the sap from these magical trees to go back and repower the crystal so your village could stay safe. So groups of characters that would go out into the world from their villages to go and collect the material from this tree to repower their village's crystals were called crystal caravans. So essentially, if you were lucky enough to get 3 of your friends together to play this game, you formed a crystal caravan, and you took a little piece of crystal with you to protect you and create like a bubble in the miasma. So everybody had to stay within a certain radius of the guy carrying the crystal. He could put the crystal down to engage in combat and whatnot, but everybody had to move in formation. They had to be very careful about what they were doing, because if they left that bubble for a certain amount of time, they would start to lose health and they would die. And each person played a different race or a different class. You had your magic caster, you had your healer, you had your tank, and you had your all-around fighter. So everybody's strengths and weaknesses all played off each other, while at the same time all having to be in close quarters in this bubble as you're moving through the world. It was brilliant. but incredibly impractical. So, like I said, having 4 people who all had GBAs, who were all willing to go out and buy the adapters to plug it into the GameCube and then all sit down and play together was just not something that gamers were willing to do at that point in time. Mm-hmm. So the game, I don't remember if it was a terribly big success. I adored the game, but aside from those people I played with when the game came out, I don't know a single person who ever bought it and played it. But it was brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from what you're describing to me, the story sounds awesome, but the gameplay sounds kind of like comparatively rudimentary, like kind of straightforward. But you still have the kind of like, you know why you're doing what you're doing, you know what the mission is, and that story base I feel like is something that a lot of games are trying to get back to now. Like Destiny is one of them, that you kind of get the kind of overarching story behind the scenes. We get it now in cutscenes, and we have for the longest time, more so because people understand cutscenes in the cinematic way a lot better than they understand what's happening in the game. Because if you had just boss fights with a little bit of dialogue, people would be like, "Well, that was boring, sort of, but super fun because I got to like cut things up."
Yeah,
we want those cutscenes, and yeah, that story focus is, I think, so important. And my last game is kind of like an evolution of Legend of Dragoon, and I know that you've had some familiarity with it. Lost Odyssey was the one that kind of stuck out to me. Similar to Namco Museum, I had it was like a week right in the middle of high school or just after high school where I played Lost Odyssey with my dad for like 3 days straight. Like we didn't do anything else but like woke up, hung out, and just played Lost Odyssey, and we're trying to figure out what to do. It's a huge game, another 4-disc like rock opera, terrible example, but like huge game. And you're the entire time trying to, 1, figure out story elements so that you understand what's happening, but 2, figure out how best to use the characters that are presented to you, because you eventually, similar to what happens in Legend of Dragoon, as your protagonist kind of progresses, you tack on new members of the team and they join the cast, and you have the opportunity to start essentially just a few of them, or I think you get up to 5 in Lost Odyssey. In Legend of Dragoon, you got 3. So in Lost Odyssey, it was kind of just like this, for me, a natural evolution from Legend of Dragoon, where it was still turn-based, but less so kind of, I guess, probably more so min-maxed characters. In Legend of Dragoon, you get everybody's capable of being a bruiser. Like if you really wanted to, you could have your magic users kind of go in there and smack the bad guy. But they're better used. They're going to be better used doing their specialty. In Lost Odyssey, you could not do that. You had to use your characters in the way they were designed to be played, which was an interesting mechanic to me, and I kind of enjoyed it from the background of like playing MMORPGs on PC with family members. But Lost Odyssey was great because it was still one of those games that focused on story.
I played it. It's very melancholy. It's very in-depth. It's very reflective. It's very sad. But the writing was top-notch. The graphics for the time were phenomenal. And rock opera is not that far-fetched. I mean, didn't it have like Jefferson Starship on the soundtrack or something? Maybe that was just a commercial. No, the intro movie in the very beginning of the game had Jefferson Starship. Or maybe it was Jefferson Airplane.
I'm going to have to revisit that. Wow.
Yeah. But no, definitely a masterpiece. It was an epic for sure. So it's one of those games where it wasn't super mainstream like a Final Fantasy game. So not a ton of people actually played it. So yeah.
If I remember correctly, I had some of the people from Final Fantasy had kind of crossed over. The same folks from Square were working on Lost Odyssey. And so a lot of people have been calling for the remake, as they have for Legend of Dragoon for now almost 2 decades. I don't even want to see a new game or a second version. I just want to see the same game remastered. That would be fantastic.
We're too far off at this point to be able to play it on like the Xbox One. I don't think they have like a backwards compatibility that goes that far back. So yeah, shit.
Yeah, so they'd have to make a fully new game, but
well, good luck with that. I mean, they've been working on the remake of Final Fantasy VII for like 10 years now, and I still don't think it's even going to come out for like another 3 years or something. It's ridiculous.
They're waiting on a new engine, I'm sure. Something like that.
Yeah, it's in production. It's just such a massive undertaking that they're going to just take their time. I've heard they're actually going to be releasing the remake of Final Fantasy VII in Chronicles, because apparently when it's finished and done and complete, the full game itself is just going to be too large to both release on a proper format or to be able to have on your game's hard drive. It's going to be that gigantic in size, so they're gonna cut it into sections and release them as episodes, which is crazy.
That's crazy.
Final Fantasy VII is incredibly long. It's like an 80-hour game, and it's gonna be like 92 episodes or something. It'll be insane.
I'm curious to see how people respond to that, because I've heard people argue about, kind of mainstream marketing perspective, how people respond to serialized content like that.
Yeah.
Because from one perspective, we're conditioned now through Netflix and kind of instant gratification, Hulu and whatever. We can pull up an entire season of a show that we love and watch it from start to finish.
Right.
But at the same time, there's examples of shows that have been released sequentially, one chapter at a time, that builds community better than even those shows that are just released out into the ether. So, I don't know. I'd be curious to see how that takes off from a video game perspective, because I can't think off the top of my head of a time that's happened before where they've been able to just have the digital platform to say, okay, this chapter's now available. Okay, now this chapter's available. So.
Well, I mean, like Telltale Games does it. They did it with their Walking Dead game. They did it with the Batman Enemy Within series, and it's been highly successful. But it's also built to be serialized. It's not a game that people are already familiar with and are eager to play again, and are only going to be able to play it like 15 hours at a time in a very small section of the overall game. Like you said, it's going to be really interesting to see how they pull this off and how they convince gamers to constantly repurchase more and more chapters of a game they played 15 years ago. I don't even want to know how expensive actually buying every single chapter and finishing the game is going to be. They're going to have to be really careful about how small these slices of the game they're going to be releasing each time is, because people are not going to want to play up until I don't know if you're familiar with. Have you played Final Fantasy VII? I can very easily see them doing the first episode stopping when you leave Midgar. And if that's the case, I will be so pissed if I've just paid $20 to play 15 hours of a game and stop right at Midgar. No, you gotta give me more than that.
It won't be $15. I think they're gonna have to, by the hour, figure out the price that way, because
something, yeah.
And I remember, and to be honest, that's not a bad estimate for the price, because I've seen that from book perspectives too, where authors will release a full book, kind of novella by novella, which is a weird way to do that. But I remember buying a book that came out in 6 parts, and I was so eager to read it. And then by the time I got all 6 pieces, and it was this is the full book, I look back at how much I spent, and I was like, that's probably double what most people pay for the finished product when it comes out, which is pretty ridiculous. So
yeah.
I don't know. We'll see what happens, but
yeah,
I hope they go the kind of virtuous route and just say, here's the full end price, and you're getting this fraction, and therefore you're gonna pay this fraction of the price. That would be a pretty awesome way to.
They're gonna have to get clever with it. They're gonna have to. Yeah, If honestly, I can see the game just being a whole. Despite the nostalgia and the clamoring for it just being a flop, if it just ends up being too expensive and too much of a time sink for players to play the game in such small pieces. So I don't know. We'll see. We got another 3 to 5 years to wait before it comes out. We can see what happens. True. So yeah.
So tune in then to the second draft when we talk about Final Fantasy VII, the remake.
Hopefully we're still around in 3 to 5 years. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We will be. Yeah. All right, so my final game of the video is, again, not something that was terribly influential on my life. It was just something I really enjoyed playing, and that was Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars on the Nintendo 3DS. So, nobody ever played this game because nobody ever bought it. Like seriously, like it was a disaster. The sales, I don't have an exact number, but it was just a huge disaster for them to develop this game and put it out because literally nobody in America bought it. Nobody. I bought it. I loved it. I was a blast. It was a throwback to like the old top-down view GTA games on like the first PlayStation and whatnot, which I dug the hell out of. But it was a more updated version, and the controls were perfect and precise, and the driving was excellent. And doing things like stealing cars had you go into like a mini game where you had to use the touchscreen on the lower part of the 3DS to like unscrew the panel and then connect the wires and twist the wire. It was awesome. It was cool as hell, and it had that GTA flavor where you're running around in Chinatown and you're going up against triads and stuff like that in like a gang war, and you're doing drug deals and you're doing hits and stuff like that. And I don't know why it never caught on. I guess maybe the public's perception of the Grand Theft Auto franchise had just moved on so far past the isometric top-down view games that people just looked at it as being too retro, I guess. Or I think it was maybe the platform at the time. Like the Nintendo DS was not really regarded as being like a serious gaming platform. It was more like a Mario type thing. So I don't know. Just a combination of things led to the game not selling well. Again, nobody's played it. I don't know actually how many people are even aware it exists. It came out in like 2009 in the States, and I mean, I don't think you could even go out and find it used if you wanted to. They're probably in a landfill somewhere next to E.T. on the Atari.
You can probably find it at like a Bookman's or something like that. Like
that's true. Yeah,
one of those like second sale stores.
Yeah.
There are two things that stick out to me about that. Is one is because I never played the game. It sounds fun from the mechanics you're mentioning.
Yeah, the portable Grand Theft Auto was awesome.
Yeah, the things that stick out to me are one, the 3DS. I think it was the handheld console that kind of bridged the gap between generations, and some people followed it, some people didn't. I followed it because my sister got one, and I was like, at that time I was like thinking I'm ready to move on from handheld consoles, and I was really into Halo and the Xbox at the time, so I wasn't playing handheld as much at that time. And I realized that more and more when I was talking to like cousins and people that were younger than me, they had like the 3DS or they had the next generation console when I was like thinking about just playing the games that I was familiar with. But I think it successfully bridged that gap, which is why some people, why I've since considered investing in handheld gaming again. Like I wanted to get the Switch because it's the next step. But the other thing that sticks out to me is the top-down view, and I think that's just like really unfamiliar, especially to that same generation that they're trying to cater the 3DS to. So when you mix those two markets, you get a Venn diagram that's kind of like, here's this crossover, and you get the people that stuck with it with the handheld gaming, and then you get the people that are cool with, and these people are cool with doing a top-down view, and then you get the new crowd that are like, I'm going to play the new game, and also I've heard about Grand Theft Auto and I like those games, and then there's a Venn diagram there, and in the middle you get the mix. And otherwise it's kind of like, well, if it doesn't pan out, it's probably because you didn't account for this group and the intersection there.
I think that's probably what happened. That's a really good summary, I think, of probably what happened with the game, because like I said, it's a blast. It's an incredibly well-made game. For being like a top-down retro-style GTA game on a handheld system, the production values were through the roof, and it was just a snazzy, fun, violent little like crime drama game, and it just didn't catch on. So, yeah.
More's the pity, but good that you got experience there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm one of the rare few who've both purchased and played the game. So, yeah, I've experienced something that the majority of people on planet Earth have and will never experience. So, yay me.
This is where we don't put affiliate links to Amazon down in the description.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's it for my list.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to throw out there? Yeah.
I've got a couple that were kind of formative games. Not so much flew under the radar though. Those ones kind of stick out as like games that were important to me, but also when I mentioned them to people, especially I guess my cornerstone for this episode was Legend of Dragoon. When I mentioned that to people, they either have never heard of it or they're like, that game was incredible and it's fantastic and it's like a cult phenomena. So just talking about it now, I'm gonna have to figure out a way to play it again. Yeah. So if that means going back to my folks' place and picking up the PlayStation and trying to find the game in a box somewhere, so be it, because it's worth it. It's really good.
Yeah, man. Yeah. If you find the game, you can borrow my PlayStation and play it.
Excellent. Yes,
yeah,
that's the
I've
plan.
Still got my old PlayStation, so it's probably more convenient for you to borrow it from me than to try and get it from your parents in Colorado. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that wraps up this episode of the Second Draft. Thanks for coming down this little trip down memory lane with us.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll learn about a game you've never heard of before, because you've probably never heard of Chinatown Wars, Grand Theft Auto, and chances are you may not have actually heard of Blade of Darkness either. I'm sure you can find gameplay videos on YouTube, so go and check them out. And if you've somehow got the means to go and track some of these games down and play them, they're well worth it. Like,
absolutely,
their flawed success does not denote a flawed in their development. Like, they're really good games. They just got a bum rap or just didn't really catch on for whatever reason. So if you've got the ability, go and check them out, because I loved playing them. Alex loved playing his list, clearly, and there's no reason you guys shouldn't enjoy playing them as well. So thank you guys as always. Leave a comment down below. Let us know what your most formative game was that nobody ever really has ever played or like remembers when you try and bring it up in conversations. I'm sure everybody's got one, so we'd love to hear yours. We'd love to talk about yours, because we spent plenty of time talking about ours, so it's only fair.
Yeah. That, and give them a try. I'd love to try out some new games. There's always that kind of like hidden gem that we've never played before or never even heard of. So let us know.
So thank you, everybody.
Signing off.
Yeah.
See you next week.